For more than a century, this hasn't happened. Not quietly, not formally, not like this. And yet, tonight, the words being whispered in Westminster corridors are the same ones now rippling across newsrooms and diplomatic desks around the world. The title is gone. Not suspended. Not sidelined. Gone. If you're expecting a dramatic royal proclamation or a palace balcony moment, stop there. That's not how this unfolded. There were no trumpets, no velvet ropes, no monarch standing at a lectern. The decision didn't come from the crown at all. It came from somewhere colder, more procedural, more dangerous. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates from UK Parliament. And that alone should make you pause. Because if Parliament can revoke a royal title, especially one as globally recognized as Duchess of Sussex, then we are no longer talking about celebrity drama or family feuds or even palace politics. We are talking about power, about authority, about the moment an institution decides that tradition has become a liability. Here's the unsettling part. This didn't arrive with chaos. It arrived with calm. No riots. No emergency sessions broadcast live on every channel. No breathless breaking news banners screaming for your attention. In fact, the most striking thing about this moment is how deliberately quiet it's been, almost restrained. As if everyone involved understood that shouting would only weaken the seriousness of what was happening. That kind of silence doesn't come from impulse. It comes from exhaustion, from patience running out, from a calculation that the consequences of doing nothing had finally outweighed the consequences of acting. And that raises the first question we have to ask, carefully, honestly, without rushing to conclusions. Why now? Why this moment, and not 5 years ago? Not 3 interviews ago? Not after the first lawsuit, or the second, or the third public rupture? Why did the machinery of the British state stay idle for so long, and then move all at once? Because this wasn't reactive. It was preparatory. Long before any vote, long before any motion, something shifted. In tone, in tolerance, in how the title itself was being perceived, not as a symbolic honor, but as a strategic risk. The Duchess of Sussex, a title that once represented inclusion, modernization, even optimism. A bridge between monarchy and modernity, between tradition and global relevance. Now, suddenly, that same title is being treated as a fault line. And before we go any further, let's slow this down. Because the instinct, especially online, is to leap straight to the personal. To reduce this to a referendum on one woman, one marriage, one set of decisions. That would be a mistake. This story is not about whether you like Meghan Markle or not. It's not about fandom or loyalty or who said what in which interview. This is about what happens when personal narratives collide with institutional limits. Because titles don't exist in a vacuum. They carry legal weight, diplomatic implications, reputational consequences that extend far beyond any single individual. When you hold a royal title, you don't just represent yourself. You represent a system, a country, a history that predates modern media and will likely outlive it. And at some point, quietly, methodically, lawmakers began asking a question they had avoided for years. Is this title still serving the institution, or is it undermining it? That question is where everything changed. Not publicly, not immediately, but behind closed doors, in briefing papers and legal memos and off-the-record conversations that never make it into headlines. This wasn't fueled by outrage. It was fueled by assessment, risk assessment, reputational assessment, constitutional assessment. Because here's the contradiction no one likes to talk about. Royal titles are meant to be above politics, but they exist inside a political framework. And when they start producing political consequences, international ones, legal ones, financial ones, Parliament doesn't get to pretend it has no role. That fiction only works until it doesn't. And lately, it hasn't. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you heard the Duchess of Sussex mentioned without controversy attached, without litigation, without diplomatic discomfort, without another round of questions about who speaks for whom? At some point, the title stopped functioning as a ceremonial designation and started operating like a megaphone, one that Parliament does not control, but is ultimately accountable for. That's the part most people miss. This wasn't about punishing speech. It wasn't about silencing criticism. It wasn't even about loyalty to the monarchy. It was about governance. about who bears responsibility when a royal title is used in ways that ripple into foreign policy, domestic trust, and the credibility of the state. And yes, that brings us to Meghan Markle herself. Or, more precisely, to the position she occupies in this story. Meghan Markle did something no royal spouse had done before her. She didn't just step away from the institution. She continued to operate as a global public figure while retaining a title that implied ongoing institutional association. That gray zone was tolerable for a while, even defensible. After all, the monarchy has survived far worse. But gray zones don't age well. They expand. They invite interpretation. And eventually, they demand clarification. The public saw a personal journey. Parliament saw an unresolved contradiction. And contradictions are what institutions exist to resolve. Here's another uncomfortable truth. This decision did not hinge on one interview, one lawsuit, or one media cycle. Those were symptoms, not causes. The real issue was cumulative, layered, built over time through repetition. Each new controversy didn't shock anyone. It fatigued them. Fatigue is far more dangerous than outrage. Outrage burns hot and fades fast. Fatigue settles in and changes behavior. It changes how tolerance is measured, how benefit of the doubt is extended, how long a system is willing to absorb friction before deciding that friction has become damage. Somewhere along the way, the Duchess of Sussex stopped being seen as an exception that could be managed and started being viewed as a variable that could not. And that's when Parliament's posture shifted, from passive observer to reluctant actor. But here's where it gets more complex. Because Parliament does not act lightly when it comes to the monarchy. Every move risks destabilizing a delicate constitutional balance. Every intervention invites accusations of overreach. So why risk it now? Because not acting had started to look like negligence. And that's a word institutions fear more than controversy. Negligence implies failure of duty, failure of oversight, failure to protect the integrity of the system itself. Behind the scenes, the conversation was no longer about Meghan as a person. It was about the title as an instrument. About whether it could continue to exist in its current form without exposing the state to ongoing risk. And once that question is asked seriously, there is no comfortable answer. Either you accept the risk indefinitely, or you intervene. Doing nothing was no longer neutral. Which brings us to the most misunderstood aspect of this entire moment. The absence of dramatic resistance from the palace. Many expected a line in the sand, a statement, a subtle pushback, something. Instead, there was restraint. That restraint has been interpreted in every possible way: betrayal, strategy, indifference, exhaustion. But what it really signals is something far more sobering. Limits. The monarchy does not govern Parliament. It exists alongside it, constrained by it, protected by it, and ultimately dependent on it for legitimacy in a democratic state. This was not a royal decision overturned by politicians. It was a political decision made in a space the monarchy cannot enter. And perhaps, quietly, would not want to. Which leaves us here, at a moment that feels definitive but doesn't quite resolve anything. The title is gone, but the questions are multiplying. What precedent does this set? For other royals? For other titles? For the boundary between symbolism and state authority? Was this accountability or escalation? Correction or overreach? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what information, what assessment, what internal conclusion convinced Parliament that this was not just justified, but necessary? Because decisions of this magnitude are never based on what the public sees. They are based on what the public doesn't. And that's where this story is really headed. Because once you understand what Parliament was weighing, what risks were discussed, what scenarios were modeled, what consequences were deemed acceptable, you begin to see that the removal of a title was not the climax. It was the opening move. It didn't begin with a roar. That's the detail that keeps coming back to me. If you were waiting for outrage, for chaos, for MPs shouting across the chamber or headlines screaming constitutional crisis in capital letters, you would have missed it entirely. The moment the line was crossed, it happened with paperwork, with procedure, with language so dry it almost disguised the gravity of what it was doing. And that's how you know it was real. Because institutions don't dramatize when they're serious. They sanitize. Inside Westminster, the mood that day wasn't hostile. It wasn't triumphant. It was clinical. There's a difference, and it matters. Hostility looks like politics. Clinical looks like inevitability. The first thing you have to understand is that nothing about this felt rushed. That's the misconception people keep making online. They assume something explosive must have triggered it. A final straw. A scandal too big to ignore. But when you speak to people who were close enough to feel the temperature change, they describe something else entirely. A slow tightening. A narrowing of options. A collective realization that the path everyone hoped would quietly resolve itself wasn't going to. So instead of emotion, what you saw was alignment. Not agreement in the moral sense. Alignment in the procedural one. Because Parliament doesn't move on vibes. It moves when enough separate actors, from different ideological corners, reach the same uncomfortable conclusion independently. That's when things get dangerous for tradition. By the time the matter formally surfaced, the arguments had already been rehearsed privately. The counterarguments too. This wasn't a debate discovering its footing in real time. It was a decision entering the public record after the real discussion was already over. That's why it felt muted. And that muteness unsettled even the people voting. One MP described it to me as the calm before a constitutional ripple. Not a wave, a ripple. Something small enough to underestimate, but powerful enough to spread outward long after the moment itself had passed. What was actually put forward was framed narrowly. Deliberately so. The language avoided personal judgment. It avoided moral language altogether. Instead, it focused on function. On whether the continued use of a royal title by a non-working royal, operating independently on the global stage, created ongoing conflicts of interest, reputational exposure, or governance ambiguities that Parliament could no longer justify ignoring. Notice what's missing there. No mention of feelings. No mention of interviews. No mention of grievances or accusations. That omission wasn't accidental. It was protective. Because the moment Parliament appears to be acting emotionally, it loses legitimacy. So it acted like an accountant balancing a ledger that no longer added up. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. When the discussion turned to precedent, the room didn't flinch. That's another thing people misunderstand. The fear of precedent didn't stop this. It fueled it. Because precedent cuts both ways. Yes, removing a royal title sets one. But allowing a title to function in a way that repeatedly tests the boundaries of constitutional neutrality also sets one. And Parliament had already been living with that second precedent for years. The question wasn't whether this move would be historic. Everyone knew it would be. The question was whether history would judge an action more harshly than intervention. That calculation is the quiet engine of governance. When the procedural steps were laid out, there was no dramatic countdown. No theatrical pause. Just a sequence. Step following step, each one making the next harder to stop. Once it entered the formal process, momentum took over. And momentum, in institutions, is merciless. What struck several observers wasn't who spoke, but who didn't. Senior figures who might once have been expected to raise alarms stayed measured. Some stayed silent altogether. Silence in these rooms isn't absence. It's consent without fingerprints. That's when it became clear this wasn't a fringe push. This was center gravity shifting. Even those who expressed discomfort didn't challenge the core logic. They questioned optics, timing, messaging, but not the underlying premise. That's how you know a line has already been crossed mentally before it's crossed procedurally. The actual moment itself was almost anticlimactic. A vote recorded. Language entered into the record. No gasps. No audible reaction. But the effect was immediate in a way that doesn't show up on camera. Staffers stopped whispering hypotheticals and started discussing implications. Legal teams moved from advisory mode to implementation mode. Communications advisors didn't scramble to spin. They began drafting explanations for a reality that now existed. That's the shift. From maybe to now. And somewhere in that transition, something subtle but profound happened. The title stopped being treated as a personal identifier and started being treated as a policy artifact. Once that happens, sentiment is irrelevant. You can hear this most clearly in how the language changed afterward. People stopped saying Meghan's title and started saying the Sussex designation. That's bureaucratic distancing. It's how systems depersonalize decisions they know will be emotionally charged. It's also how they protect themselves from accusation. Because once a title is framed as an instrument rather than an honor, its removal becomes an administrative act, not a moral judgment. That framing didn't emerge overnight. It had been developing quietly for a long time. Which brings us to the question most people keep asking, usually with disbelief. Why didn't anyone stop this? The short answer is that by the time it reached this stage, stopping it would have required someone to argue that ambiguity was preferable to clarity. That risk was preferable to resolution. No one was willing to make that argument out loud, partly because it had become indefensible, partly because it would have required taking ownership of consequences that were no longer theoretical. Think about it this way. Every time the title was used in a context that blurred institutional boundaries, Parliament absorbed a little more liability. Not legal liability in the narrow sense. Political liability, diplomatic liability, reputational liability. Those costs accumulate even when nothing explodes, especially when nothing explodes, because unresolved tension doesn't dissipate. It compounds. At some point, the question shifted from "can we live with this?" to "why are we still living with this?" And once that question is asked often enough, it stops being rhetorical. There was also something else at play, something few want to acknowledge openly. Public patience had thinned, not outrage, not hostility, something quieter and more corrosive. Indifference edged with irritation, a sense that the saga had become endless, cyclical, unresolved. Institutions are acutely sensitive to that kind of mood, not because they chase popularity, but because legitimacy depends on perceived coherence. When the public no longer understands why a structure exists in a certain form, that structure becomes vulnerable. The title, once a symbol of continuity, had started to look like a loose thread, and loose threads make lawmakers nervous. So when the final procedural threshold was crossed, it didn't feel like a rupture to the people inside the process. It felt like closure, not emotional closure, administrative closure. But closure for institutions often feels like loss to individuals. That's where the disconnect lies. Outside the chamber, the reaction was delayed. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the familiar polarization. But inside, the work had already moved on. Because Parliament doesn't linger. It files. It implements. It prepares for the next consequence. And there will be consequences. Not just for Meghan Markle. Not just for the Sussexes. But for how royal identity is understood going forward. The title's removal didn't erase a person. It redefined a boundary that had been fuzzy for too long. And the moment that boundary snapped into focus, everyone realized something else too. This wasn't the most controversial thing Parliament could have done. It was the most restrained thing it believed it could still justify. That realization should unsettle you, because it suggests that other options were considered. More drastic ones. Less visible ones. Options that didn't make it to a vote because this one was deemed sufficient. For now. Which raises a question that hasn't been answered yet, and won't be answered publicly anytime soon. What exactly did Parliament see that convinced it this was the least disruptive path forward? Because institutions don't choose firsts lightly. They choose them when they believe the alternative is worse. And if this was the moderate option, then the full range of concerns must have been far more serious than anyone outside the room has been told. That's where this story stops being about a single title and starts becoming about the architecture of power itself. Because once Parliament demonstrates that it is willing to act this decisively, it signals something not just to the monarchy, but to the entire system surrounding it. Limits exist. They can be enforced. And they will be, when ambiguity becomes unsustainable. But what those limits are, and how far they extend, is still unclear. There's a comforting myth people cling to when it comes to royal titles. That they're ancient, immutable, handed down by history itself, beyond the reach of modern governance. Something closer to a birthmark than a credential. It's not true. And the reason this story escalated so quickly, once it began, is because the people inside the system have always known it wasn't true. Royal titles feel mystical because they're wrapped in ceremony. But beneath the robes and oaths and carefully choreographed symbolism, they are administrative constructs, legal recognitions, instruments that exist because the state allows them to exist. That distinction is subtle and explosive, because if a title is an instrument, then someone has to be responsible for its consequences. And responsibility always ends up in the same place. With Parliament. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, especially for audiences raised on the idea that the monarchy exists above politics. It doesn't. It exists beside politics, constrained by it, and, when necessary, corrected by it. That's not anti-monarchist rhetoric. That's constitutional reality. In the UK system, the Crown is sovereign in form, but Parliament is sovereign in function. Titles originate with the monarch, yes, but their legal standing, their public authority, their enforceability in the modern state, those are upheld by statute, convention, and parliamentary consent. That balance works beautifully when everyone stays within their lanes. It starts to fray when those lanes blur. And the Duchess of Sussex title had become, in the eyes of lawmakers, a blur. The first misconception that needs dismantling is the idea that removing a royal title requires a dramatic royal intervention. A king stripping a dukedom in anger. A palace decree. A public rebuke. That image persists because it's cinematic. It feels medieval. It feels emotionally satisfying. It's also largely outdated. Modern British constitutional practice doesn't work through royal fiat in the way people imagine. The monarchy acts on advice. Parliament defines the framework within which that advice has meaning. That's why Parliament matters here more than the palace ever could. And it's why this move didn't originate with a monarch. The second misconception is that there is no precedent at all. That this was some unprecedented leap into the unknown. There is precedent, just not the kind people recognize immediately. Throughout British history, titles have been adjusted, curtailed, sidelined, or rendered functionally meaningless through parliamentary mechanisms. Sometimes quietly, sometimes indirectly, often without the dramatic language people expect. What's rare isn't the adjustment of titles. What's rare is the clarity. Usually, systems prefer ambiguity. Ambiguity allows everyone to save face. It allows tradition to bend without appearing to break. But ambiguity had become the problem. For years, the Sussex title existed in a kind of constitutional limbo, public-facing, globally visible, but institutionally disconnected. A title without duties. Authority without accountability. Symbolism without oversight. That arrangement was tolerated because it was framed as temporary. Transitional. A moment of adjustment after a historic departure. Temporary arrangements have a dangerous habit of becoming permanent if no one forces a decision. And Parliament eventually did. The mechanism itself wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. It relied on established parliamentary authority over honors, public offices, and the legal recognition of titles within the state. This is where people get lost, because they assume dukedoms are purely ceremonial. They're not. They carry implications for protocol, representation, and perception, both domestically and internationally. When a titled individual operates on the global stage, they are often perceived as speaking with institutional proximity, whether or not that's intended. That perception creates diplomatic noise, confusion, occasionally friction. Parliament cannot pretend that doesn't matter, especially when the individual in question is not acting under the constraints or guidance of the institution the title represents. This wasn't about speech. It wasn't about criticism. It wasn't about whether Meghan Markle was right or wrong in her grievances. It was about the state's inability to control the meaning of a title it still legally recognized. That loss of control is intolerable to any functioning system. There's a phrase that kept appearing in internal discussions, according to people familiar with the process. Operational clarity. It sounds dull. It's anything but. Operational clarity means knowing who represents what, under which authority, and with what accountability. It means eliminating gray zones that can be exploited, intentionally or not. The Sussex title had become a gray zone large enough to drive a convoy through. And here's where the irony sharpens. For years, critics accused the monarchy of being too rigid, too slow to modernize, too attached to tradition. Yet when the system finally moved to clarify boundaries, those same critics cried foul. That contradiction isn't accidental. It reflects a deeper discomfort with the idea that modern institutions still have limits. People like change. They don't like enforcement. But enforcement is what keeps systems coherent. One MP put it bluntly in private. You can't have a title that behaves like a brand. That line stuck. Because brands answer to markets. Institutions answer to governance. The Sussex title had crossed that line in perception, if not in intention. And perception matters more than intent in constitutional law. It matters because law deals in effects, not feelings. Once that conclusion settled, the remaining question wasn't whether Parliament could act. It was how narrowly it could act without destabilizing the entire honors system. That's why the language was so careful, why the scope was so specific, why the action targeted recognition, not identity. No one was erased. No one was exiled. No one was punished in the punitive sense. The state simply withdrew its endorsement. An endorsement is everything. Think about it this way. A title without state recognition is a courtesy, a social label, a historical footnote. A title with state recognition is authority adjacent. Parliament decided that adjacency was no longer acceptable. That decision also reflects a broader shift in how the UK views monarchy in the 21st century. Less as a mystical inheritance and more as a public institution that must justify its structures. That shift didn't begin with Meghan Markle, but her case forced it into the open, because she occupied a position that exposed the tension between personal narrative and institutional expectation more clearly than anyone before her. She was both inside and outside, connected and independent, visible and unaccountable. Systems can handle one contradiction at a time, not five. And here's the part that complicates the story further. Parliament didn't act because it suddenly discovered this power. It acted because it had avoided using it for too long. Avoidance creates precedent too. Every year that passed without resolution strengthened the argument that the ambiguity was being tacitly accepted. That silence was consent. Eventually, that argument became a liability. Because once silence is interpreted as endorsement, withdrawing it becomes harder. That's why the move, when it came, was decisive. Hesitation would have undermined the logic of the action itself. If Parliament had wavered, it would have signaled uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing institutions cannot afford when redefining boundaries. That's also why the palace didn't intervene. Not because it lacked feeling, but because it lacked jurisdiction. The monarchy's role in this framework is symbolic continuity, not regulatory enforcement. It cannot override Parliament without inviting a constitutional crisis far larger than any single title. Restraint, in this context, was responsibility, which leaves Meghan Markle in a peculiar position. Stripped of a title, but not of a platform. Disconnected from the institution, but not from the conversation surrounding it. In some ways, this move frees her. In others, it isolates her. Because without the title, every future action will be interpreted differently. No longer as a renegade royal voice, but as a private individual with an extraordinary history. That shift matters more than it seems. It changes how criticism lands, how sympathy is framed, how legitimacy is debated, and it raises a question few are ready to confront. Did Parliament, in seeking clarity, also remove a buffer that had absorbed much of the tension? Because titles don't just grant authority, they absorb blame. Without it, narratives sharpen, and sharpened narratives rarely de-escalate. That's why some lawmakers, even those who supported the move, expressed quiet unease afterward. Not regret, unease. Because while the constitutional logic was sound, the social consequences were unpredictable. And unpredictability is where institutions get nervous. The move clarified authority. It did not clarify outcomes. Which brings us to the deeper issue that lurked beneath every discussion, every memo, every cautious word choice. This wasn't just about the Duchess of Sussex. It was about how far Parliament is willing to go to protect institutional coherence in a media environment that thrives on disruption. It was about whether modern governance can coexist with symbolic systems without constant friction. And it was about something else, too. If Parliament can step in here, on this issue, using these mechanisms, then it has reminded everyone that royal identity is not beyond reach. It is conditional, and conditions can be reevaluated. That realization landed quietly, but it landed hard. Because once you understand that titles are not untouchable, you start to see the monarchy differently. Not as an immovable monument, but as a living structure subject to maintenance, adjustment, and yes, intervention. That's not revolutionary. It's administrative. And administrative power is the most underestimated force in politics. So when people ask whether Parliament overstepped, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is whether Parliament waited too long. Because every year of delay made this moment sharper, more visible, more disruptive than it might have been if addressed earlier. And that delay wasn't accidental. It was human. Institutions avoid confrontation until avoidance becomes riskier than action. We're now living in the aftermath of that calculation. There's a temptation, when a system breaks down around a person, to assume the person caused the fracture. It's a clean story. Morally satisfying. Easy to package. It's also usually wrong. Because systems don't crack because of one individual. They crack because an individual exposes stresses that were already there, quietly accumulating, long before anyone noticed. That's the only way to understand why Meghan Markle was always going to be an outlier in this structure, regardless of intent, temperament, or outcome. Meghan Markle did not enter the British monarchy as a blank slate. She arrived with a fully formed public identity, a professional history, and an understanding of media power that was fundamentally modern. That alone set her apart. The monarchy is designed to absorb people by stripping away their prior selves. Careers dissolve. Individual narratives are subsumed into collective symbolism. Personality is flattened into role. That process has worked for centuries because those who enter the system usually do so young, malleable, and willing to disappear into the institution. Meghan didn't disappear, not because she refused to, but because the world she came from no longer requires disappearance to maintain relevance. In fact, it punishes it. That's the first structural mismatch. The monarchy still operates on the assumption that authority flows from silence, restraint, and distance. Modern celebrity culture operates on visibility, narrative control, and engagement. Those two logics are not compatible. They can coexist briefly. They cannot merge. In the early days, this mismatch was framed as refreshing, a breath of modernity, proof that the institution could evolve. And to be fair, there were moments when that felt true. But evolution requires reciprocity. Both sides must adapt. And in this case, only one side was truly capable of doing so. The monarchy bends slowly, if at all. It survives by outlasting trends, not chasing them. That isn't stubbornness. It's design. Meghan came from a world where adaptation is survival, where relevance must be actively maintained, not passively inherited. Those instincts don't shut off because of a title. They sharpen. From the very beginning, advisors noted something that would later become significant. Meghan understood optics in a way the institution did not fully appreciate. She grasped how narratives form, how silence can be interpreted as guilt, how proactive framing can shape public sympathy. These are not manipulative skills. They are survival skills in modern media. But within the monarchy, those same instincts read as disruptive. Because the system relies on a shared understanding, no one controls the story alone. The institution does. That's the second mismatch. The monarchy doesn't negotiate narrative. It endures it. That approach works when the participants accept the trade-off. Personal voice in exchange for institutional protection. Meghan never fully accepted that trade-off. Not because she rejected the institution, but because the cost of silence was higher for her than for those who came before. And that difference matters. It matters because the monarchy's tolerance for deviation is inversely proportional to how visible the deviation is. A quiet outlier can be absorbed. A visible one becomes a problem. What followed was a series of adjustments, compromises, and half measures that, in hindsight, look less like solutions and more like delays. The system tried to accommodate her without redefining itself. She tried to redefine her role without dismantling the system. Neither approach was sustainable. Every attempt to carve out a middle ground created new ambiguity. And ambiguity, as we've seen, is what ultimately triggered parliamentary concern. It's important to say this clearly, because it gets lost in the noise. This was not a personality clash. It was a structural incompatibility. Personality clashes can be managed. They burn out. They shift. They can be mediated. Structural incompatibilities escalate. They do so quietly at first, through misunderstandings and unmet expectations. Then more loudly, through public tension and institutional strain. By the time the break becomes visible, the conditions that caused it are already entrenched. One former palace aide put it this way, carefully. She was operating in good faith. So was the institution. They were just speaking different languages. That's not a condemnation. It's a diagnosis. The monarchy speaks in continuity. Meghan spoke in immediacy. The monarchy values opacity. Meghan valued transparency. The monarchy treats time as an ally. Meghan treated time as a risk. None of those positions are inherently wrong, but they are mutually destabilizing. For a while, novelty masked the problem. The public fascination, the symbolism of progress, the hope that this marriage represented a new chapter for the crown. Hope buys time, but hope doesn't resolve contradictions. It delays them. And as the contradictions multiplied, the system began to respond the only way it knows how, by pulling inward. That inward pull felt, to Meghan, like resistance, like rejection, like punishment. To the institution, it felt like self-preservation. Both interpretations can be true at the same time. And that duality is what makes this story so difficult to reduce to heroes and villains. When Meghan and Prince Harry stepped back from royal duties, many believed the tension would dissipate. Distance, after all, resolves friction. Instead, distance magnified it, because stepping back removed the informal constraints that had previously governed behavior. It also removed the internal channels that allowed for quiet correction. What remained was visibility without oversight. That's the moment Parliament eventually zeroed in on. From a constitutional perspective, it didn't matter why Meghan spoke publicly. It didn't matter whether her grievances were justified. It mattered that the title continued to operate as an amplifier. Amplification without accountability is the one thing institutions cannot tolerate. That's not about Meghan specifically. That's about any individual occupying a symbolic role with global reach. The Sussex title didn't just identify a person. It carried the aura of the British state, whether anyone wanted it to or not. And Meghan, with her media fluency, understood that aura better than most. That understanding made her powerful. It also made her position untenable, because the system had no mechanism to integrate that power safely. Here's another uncomfortable layer. Meghan's background, experience, and expectations were shaped by a merit-based culture. You build influence by work, visibility, and impact. The monarchy operates on inherited legitimacy. Influence is assumed, not earned. Those two models collide most violently when someone accustomed to earning influence enters a space where influence is supposed to be silent. That collision was inevitable. And once it occurred, the institution began to experience something it hadn't planned for. Narrative competition. For the first time in modern memory, the monarchy wasn't the sole author of its own story. Meghan and Harry didn't just challenge the institution. They introduced an alternative narrative that the institution couldn't control. That was the turning point. Not because the narrative was critical. Institutions can survive criticism. They struggle with competition, especially when that competition is emotionally compelling, globally broadcast, and rooted in personal testimony. From Parliament's vantage point, this wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about narrative sovereignty. Who speaks with authority? Who defines reality? Who carries the weight of representation? Those questions are political whether anyone wants them to be or not. And once Parliament began viewing the situation through that lens, the issue stopped being personal entirely. It became structural. That's why the eventual intervention feels so cold, so detached, so procedural. Because by the time it arrived, Meghan Markle was no longer being assessed as a person. She was being assessed as a variable, and variables get managed. This doesn't mean the system was right in every choice it made. It doesn't mean Meghan was wrong in every stand she took. It means the space between them became unmanageable. And when that happens, the system always chooses itself. Not out of malice, out of survival. There's a tragic irony in that. The very qualities that made Meghan a compelling symbol of modernization, her voice, her independence, her unwillingness to disappear, are the same qualities that made her incompatible with a structure that depends on controlled invisibility. The system praised her for changing the image, then recoiled when the change had consequences. That contradiction doesn't resolve cleanly. It calcifies. And by the time Parliament acted, it wasn't acting on emotion. It was acting on accumulated friction that no longer had a release valve. Which brings us to the next layer of this story. Because once the system concluded that Meghan herself was not the problem, but that the arrangement was, the focus shifted away from personality and toward architecture, toward how a private family issue had quietly transformed into a public constitutional concern. Because the moment something stops being containable within the palace, It becomes something Parliament can no longer ignore. And that transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day, lawmakers realized they weren't watching a royal dispute anymore. They were managing a state problem. And that realization is what moved this story out of the realm of personal tragedy and into the machinery of governance. That's where we're headed next. Because the path from palace tension to parliamentary intervention is longer, more complex, and more revealing than anyone wants to admit. And once you see how that transformation occurred, it becomes clear that this outcome was not as sudden as it appeared. It was delayed, and delays have consequences. The moment something leaves the palace, it stops being private. That sounds obvious. It isn't. For generations, the British monarchy has survived because it mastered a very specific trick: absorbing turmoil internally. Rows happened. Resentments festered. Relationships fractured. But the institution kept those fractures inside thick walls and even thicker conventions. What didn't escape couldn't destabilize. That containment was never perfect, but it was usually good enough. Good enough to prevent personal conflict from becoming a matter of state. Good enough to keep Parliament at arm's length. Until it wasn't. Because once a royal issue stops being containable, once it spills beyond the orbit of Buckingham Palace, it changes category. It stops being a family problem. It stops being a media problem. It becomes something colder and far more consequential. A governance problem. That shift didn't happen with a single interview or announcement. It happened through repetition, through the slow accumulation of moments that, individually, seemed survivable. Together, they weren't. From Parliament's perspective, the early stages were tolerable. Uncomfortable, yes. Awkward, certainly. But still within the realm of palace-managed affairs. The assumption, rarely spoken aloud, but widely shared, was that the monarchy would find a way to absorb the shock and restore equilibrium. That assumption bought time. But time has a cost. Every public intervention, every statement, every legal dispute that carried the echo of a royal title chipped away at the illusion of containment. The palace could issue carefully worded responses. It could stay silent. It could project continuity. What it couldn't do anymore was control the perimeter. And perimeter control is everything. Once the Sussex situation extended beyond the palace's internal mechanisms, Parliament began noticing a pattern that made it increasingly uneasy. Not outrage. Not scandal. Pattern. The title was still in circulation, but the institution that conferred its meaning was no longer shaping how it was understood. That's a red flag in any system. Because when a symbol detaches from its source of authority, it becomes unstable. It can be interpreted, repurposed, contested. It starts doing work the system never intended it to do. From a governance standpoint, that's not a narrative problem. It's a structural one. The palace, for its part, tried to hold the line without escalating. Silence was its preferred tool. Silence has worked before. Silence suggests dignity. It implies restraint. But silence also creates a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty. They get filled by interpretation, speculation, and competing narratives. Each one further weakening the palace's ability to reclaim control. At first, Parliament watched. Then it listened. Eventually, it began asking questions. Not about blame, but about exposure. Exposure to what, exactly? To misinterpretation. To diplomatic confusion. To the perception that private individuals were operating with quasi-official status in contexts that the state did not authorize or supervise. These weren't theoretical concerns. They came up in briefings. In committee conversations. In discussions that rarely make headlines because they lack drama but shape outcomes all the same. The palace could no longer guarantee containment. That's the point at which Parliament's role changes. Because Parliament doesn't intervene to resolve feelings. It intervenes when the boundaries of responsibility blur. And those boundaries had blurred beyond repair. What complicated matters further was the palace's constitutional position. It could not publicly contradict Parliament without triggering a crisis far larger than the Sussex issue itself. Nor could it publicly defend the title in a way that would bind the state to outcomes it didn't control. So it did the only thing it could do. It stepped back. That restraint has been misread as indifference, even betrayal. But within the constitutional framework, it was something else entirely. Acknowledgement of limits. The monarchy does not exist to overrule Parliament. It exists because Parliament allows it to exist. That reality is rarely tested in public. When it is, the monarchy's survival instinct is to yield, not confront. Yielding looks passive from the outside. From the inside, it's calculated. By refusing to escalate, the palace avoided transforming a governance question into a constitutional standoff. It allowed Parliament to act within its own remit without forcing the crown into an impossible position. That choice had consequences. It also prevented worse ones. Meanwhile, the issue kept evolving beyond the palace's reach. Each new chapter reinforced the same problem. The title was active in the world, but the institution behind it was not directing that activity. For Parliament, that's untenable. Governments can tolerate criticism. They struggle with ambiguity about representation. When someone is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as adjacent to the state, their actions reverberate beyond personal consequence. And the Sussex title carried that adjacency, whether anyone wanted it to or not. This is where the transformation became irreversible. The moment Parliament began receiving briefings that framed the situation not as royal drama, but as reputational exposure, the matter crossed a threshold. Exposure to what the UK stands for. Exposure to how its institutions are perceived. Exposure to questions of accountability that Parliament could not deflect indefinitely. The palace, bound by convention and constitutional restraint, could not resolve those concerns. Parliament, by design, could. That's when the conversation shifted from, should this be managed internally, to, why is this still internal? Once that question is asked, the endgame begins. Not immediately, not publicly, but structurally. Committees examine frameworks. Advisors map authority. Legal counsel reviews precedent. Each step builds a case that feels less like intervention and more like correction. From the outside, it looks sudden. From the inside, it feels overdue. There's another layer here that rarely gets acknowledged. The monarchy relies on Parliament not just for authority, but for cover, for distance, for insulation from direct accountability in modern democratic terms. When Parliament begins to feel exposed by a royal issue, when it feels that insulation is failing, it will act to restore it. That's not hostility. It's self-defense. And by the time Parliament moved, the Sussex situation had begun to erode that buffer. Questions were being asked that Parliament could no longer redirect toward the palace. International partners were seeking clarity that the palace was not positioned to provide. That's when a private matter becomes a public responsibility. At that point, Parliament's calculus changes completely. It's no longer weighing tradition against modernity. It's weighing clarity against confusion. And clarity always wins. What's striking is how carefully Parliament avoided moral language throughout this process. There was no condemnation, no public censure, no attempt to adjudicate personal truth. Instead, it focused on the title itself, its function, its implications, its continued viability. That focus wasn't accidental. It was defensive. By targeting the mechanism rather than the individual, Parliament insulated itself from accusations of personal animus. It framed the move as administrative necessity rather than ideological statement. That framing made the action harder to oppose. Because how do you argue against clarity? You can argue about fairness, about optics, about timing. But those arguments weaken when the core issue is framed as structural incoherence. And that incoherence had become undeniable. The palace's silence, once interpreted as grace, began to read as acquiescence. Not because it wanted the outcome, but because it recognized that it could no longer contain the problem on its own terms. That's the paradox of constitutional monarchy. Power is preserved by restraint, but restraint can also look like surrender. In this case, it was neither. It was boundary recognition. The palace recognized that the Sussex issue had outgrown its jurisdiction. Parliament recognized that it had inherited the problem by default. And default responsibility is still responsibility. So when the decision finally emerged, it felt oddly inevitable to those closest to the process. Not because it was easy, but because every alternative had been exhausted or ruled out. Silence had failed. Accommodation had failed. Ambiguity had failed. All that remained was resolution. That resolution, however, came with a cost. By stepping in, Parliament didn't just remove a title. It signaled a willingness to redraw the boundary between royal symbolism and state authority. That signal will echo, because once a line is redrawn, everyone starts measuring where the new one lies. And the palace, for all its history and ceremony, now has to operate within that new geometry. So does everyone else. The Sussex case was never just about one couple or one title. It was about where responsibility begins and ends in a modern constitutional state. And once Parliament answered that question, even partially, it changed the conversation forever. But the most consequential part of this shift didn't happen in public. It happened in rooms with no cameras, no transcripts, and no appetite for drama. Rooms where lawmakers were shown things the public never saw, briefings that didn't circulate, assessments that didn't leak, concerns that couldn't be aired without making the problem worse. That's the part we haven't talked about yet. Because Parliament did not act blind, it acted informed, and whatever it saw in those private sessions changed the tone decisively. The mood shifted from manage this to end this. Not out of spite, out of risk calculation. Which leads us to the next chapter of this story. Because if Parliament was willing to cross a line it had avoided for generations, it wasn't doing so on instinct or impatience. It was acting on information. Information deemed serious enough to justify a first. And once you understand what kind of material forces an institution to accept that level of risk, the story becomes far more unsettling than a headline about a title ever could. The absence was louder than any statement could have been. That's the part people still struggle to reconcile. When Parliament moved, when the procedural gears began turning in ways that could not be reversed quietly, many expected resistance from the palace. A signal, a warning, even a carefully coded expression of concern. Instead, there was nothing. No briefing pushed to friendly outlets. No discreet intervention. No last-minute attempt to slow the process. Just restraint. And in a story like this, restraint isn't neutrality. It's a position. To understand why the palace didn't intervene, you have to discard the romantic idea of royal power as something that can simply be asserted when emotions run high. That version of the monarchy hasn't existed for generations. The modern crown survives by knowing exactly when not to move. And this was one of those moments. Inside Buckingham Palace, the calculus wasn't about loyalty or betrayal. It wasn't about protecting one individual over another. It was about constitutional exposure. The palace is not blind to public sentiment, but it doesn't answer to it directly. It answers to something narrower and far more fragile: constitutional legitimacy. That legitimacy depends on one core principle that overrides everything else. The monarchy does not interfere with Parliament. Not overtly. Not covertly. Not when Parliament is operating within its legal remit. Any attempt to do so would not just have failed. It would have detonated a far larger crisis than the Sussex issue ever could. This is where popular narratives collapse under scrutiny. People imagine the palace as a shadowy force pulling strings, exerting quiet influence behind the scenes. Sometimes that's true in matters of symbolism and diplomacy. But when it comes to Parliament's authority, those strings are deliberately short. And in this case, they were effectively cut. By the time the issue reached Parliament's formal processes, it had already crossed a threshold that the palace could not reverse without overstepping its role. One senior constitutional advisor described it succinctly. Once Parliament frames something as a matter of governance rather than tradition, the palace steps back or risks its own position. That's the reality. Intervening would have meant challenging Parliament's assessment of risk. It would have meant asserting that the monarchy, not elected representatives, was better positioned to judge the consequences of continued ambiguity. That argument would not have held. More importantly, it would have invited scrutiny of the monarchy's own handling of the situation over the preceding years. Silence can be strategic, but when challenged, it can also be read as abdication. The palace had no incentive to open that door. There's another uncomfortable truth here. The palace's silence wasn't sudden. It had been developing. For a long time, the institution had been narrowing its public posture regarding the Sussexes. Statements became rarer. Engagements disappeared. Language shifted subtly from inclusion to distance. This wasn't punishment. It was boundary setting. And boundaries, once established, tend to harden. By the time Parliament acted, the palace had already signaled, without saying it outright, that it no longer viewed the Sussex situation as something it could or should manage directly. That handoff wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. In constitutional terms, it was implicit. The monarchy had reached the edge of its jurisdiction and stopped. That decision likely came with its own internal conflict. Institutions aren't monoliths. There would have been differing views, disagreements, unease about how history might interpret restraint. But restraint is the monarchy's primary survival mechanism. And survival, in this context, meant avoiding the appearance of defending a structure that Parliament had already judged to be unsustainable. Another factor rarely acknowledged publicly is the monarchy's acute awareness of timing. This was not a moment when the crown could afford to look self-protective. Any perception that it was shielding titles from scrutiny while ordinary institutions were expected to modernize would have been corrosive. The palace understood that its credibility depended on allowing Parliament to assert its authority without obstruction. That doesn't mean the outcome was desired. It means it was accepted. And acceptance, in institutional terms, is a form of consent. Which brings us to the role of the monarch himself. King Charles III inherited a crown already under pressure to demonstrate relevance, restraint, and accountability. His reign began in a climate of heightened scrutiny, not inherited deference. Every move he makes is interpreted through that lens. In that context, intervening to preserve a contested title would have been read not as leadership, but as defensiveness, as prioritizing internal cohesion over public accountability. That's not a position a modern monarch can afford to occupy. Silence, then, became the least destabilizing option. It allowed Parliament to act without forcing the crown into a constitutional confrontation. It preserved the monarchy's claim to neutrality, and it avoided setting a precedent in which royal intervention could be expected whenever Parliament addressed matters adjacent to the crown. That precedent would have been far more dangerous than the loss of any single title. But silence has consequences. By not intervening, the palace effectively allowed Parliament to define the narrative, to frame the action as administrative necessity rather than institutional conflict. That framing has stuck, and it has shaped public understanding of the event in ways that may outlast the immediate controversy. The palace's restraint also sent a signal internally that the Sussex issue was no longer central to the monarchy's strategic priorities. That message wasn't delivered with cruelty. It didn't need to be. It was delivered through absence. Absence from planning. Absence from engagement. Absence from defense. For those paying close attention, that absence spoke volumes. It suggested that the monarchy had already moved on emotionally, if not symbolically, that it had accepted the cost of separation, and that it was prepared to let Parliament resolve what the palace could not. This has been interpreted by some as abandonment. But abandonment implies a duty unfulfilled. The monarchy's duty is not to protect individuals from the consequences of constitutional processes. Its duty is to preserve the stability of the system itself. In this case, those duties diverged. Choosing the system meant relinquishing control over the outcome, and that choice carries its own weight. It also reframes the role of Parliament in a way that many are only now beginning to grasp. Parliament did not act against the palace. It acted in the space the palace vacated. That distinction matters, because it suggests coordination of boundaries rather than conflict of authority. The palace did not fight because it recognized that this was no longer its fight to win. That recognition is sobering. It tells us that, internally, the monarchy had already accepted that the Sussex arrangement had failed. Not as a marriage, not as a family, but as an institutional experiment. And failed experiments get discontinued. Quietly, if possible. Decisively, if necessary. The palace's hope, it seems, was that Parliament's action would bring clarity without forcing the monarchy to publicly articulate its own limits. So far, that hope has largely been realized. But there is a cost to letting others draw your boundaries for you. Because once Parliament demonstrates that it can intervene this directly, it expands the realm of what is considered appropriate oversight. And that expansion will not be forgotten. The palace now operates in a landscape where parliamentary authority over royal symbolism has been exercised visibly and successfully. That changes the equilibrium. It doesn't end the monarchy. It doesn't weaken it overnight. But it alters the implicit contract between tradition and governance. And implicit contracts, once rewritten, rarely revert to their original form, which leaves one more uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If the palace chose not to intervene because it believed Parliament's concerns were valid, or at least not worth contesting, What exactly were those concerns? Because silence is easier to justify when the underlying logic is sound. It's harder to justify when the action is purely political. The palace's restraint suggests it accepted Parliament's risk assessment, and that implies knowledge, not necessarily of specific details, but of seriousness, of gravity, of consequences that outweighed the symbolic cost of losing a title. That's the part of this story that still hasn't surfaced publicly. Because while the palace stayed silent and Parliament spoke through procedure, the real drivers of this decision remain obscured, hidden behind classifications, briefings, and assessments that were never meant for public consumption. Those materials didn't leak. They didn't need to. Their impact is already visible. And understanding what kind of information